Good evening. Welcome once again to our Carinine Hour, in which we discuss matters related to the development of our beloved Bahamaland. This evening I want to continue a conversation with Dr. Morrison, who is very familiar not only to our listeners and viewers, but who is well known throughout the islands. And so welcome to have you back once again.
Thank you, Archbishop. It's good to be here.
I just returned from Guyana on last Saturday, where the bishops led a special service for Bishop Moss in the cathedral in Georgetown, which happens to be the largest wooden building in the world. And I was so pleasantly surprised by the attendance, because the entire morning it was pouring rain, and yet we had a cathedral full of people who came to pay tribute. And the president, who is an Anglican, broke his vacation to be back for the service, just to show appreciation for the work. And as a Bahamian, I felt very proud, because in 5 short years, Bishop Moss obviously had made a tremendous difference to the church, and a difference that was appreciated by the wider society. And so very often it isn't so much the time, but the quality of the effort that one puts into it that makes the real difference. But
definitely,
it was quite a moving experience, and it was also a time for the bishops to reflect, because there is no question that when we look to I am in the older generation now, we call the first generation of West Indian bishops, and now we've passed the mantle on to a younger generation, and he was one of the leading lights in that group, so it was for us a great loss. I mention that to say that Bahamians can make contributions, and God has gifted us in many ways, and sometimes we don't know what it is that we have. And sometimes we are our own worst enemies in terms of how we see ourselves and how we sell ourselves.
Definitely, and I think sacred scripture also helps us to see that the prophet is never without honor except in his own hometown. So, and certainly the pastoral ministry that would have been offered by the late Bishop Moss certainly impacted those who felt that they were on the margins of the society, and that outpouring of love and devotion that you talked about was not just upon clergy, but in the laity, in those who did not necessarily hold any high office in the church, but just was impacted by his pastoral care. And I think that is something that all of us who are involved in the doings of Christian ministry must recognize and remember, that we are really called to be that that pastoral, that caregiving, that presence that reminds us that it's okay to love unconditionally without looking for reward.
Well, that reminds me of a few weeks ago I delivered a lecture at a clergy conference in Trinidad for Anglican clergy. They have this every 3 years, and I did a lecture on clergy identity, and I was surprised by the reaction I got to. One of my themes was this business of participating in the ministry of Jesus and following his example, that when you look at him in his ministry, he is totally available. And I talked about how we are available in our pastoral care in different settings, and a lot of the comments that were raised were questioning the extent to which one is expected to be available, or how reasonable is it to be that available. And I was, in a sense, quite shocked at the number of persons who reacted to that theme.
I think the part of the challenge is, in many instances, we have become like the disciples, very protective of what we perceive is God's gift. And we see people as interruptions or as intrusions, rather than seeing them as vulnerable persons needing that care, needing that mentorship, needing that kind of love. I think that we have, in many respects, cheapened the doing of Christian ministry by creating this star-like atmosphere where the minister is the center of everything, rather than the people of God being the center of what we do and what we say, and that we live out our yes to God is within the context of community, and that it is a community that must benefit from that. Yes, it is personal. My response to God's incursion is personal, but it is to impact others for good and for God. And I think within the 21st century, certainly within the ending part of the 20th century, we have been losing that sense of pastoral shepherding, that shepherding metaphor that the guys like Thomas Oden and those talk about.
And unquestionably, I think, and this is across the denominations, I think there's been a devaluation of pastoral care under the guise of becoming more business-like and more professional.
Definitely.
I think this was taking place certainly in the last quarter of the 20th century, this whole revisiting of the place of professionalism. And to me, it's done a lot of damage, because when you look at the New Testament, there can be no question that the New Testament church is a community of faith, and the community comes first. The metaphor of the body of Christ, you belong to the body, and to, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, the eye can't take over the foot, and that you belong and you find your raison d'etre within the context of the body.
Yes.
But certainly in a lot of North American Christianity, everything focuses on the pastor.
Yes, because it's a matter of marketing. The pastor is now the CEO of this spiritual organization. And I think that, interesting, you referenced the early church, and I think that the first signs of death in the early church was Ananias and Sapphira, because you can't choose the parameters under which you're going to give expression to your faith. The community has already set boundaries, and if you're going to be a part of it, you have to go full-heartedly. And I think that there's such a pretentiousness that has overtaken not just clergy, but those who are in the unordained ministry, that everyone just flamming, pretending, rather than, look, I'm doing this because my heart is in it. I'm doing it because the love of Christ constrains me. I'm doing it because I realize that the giftings that have been entrusted to me are really not for me, but really to empower the body and cause the body to function in its optimum form.
So that's the whole question of Ephesians 4, and
absolutely,
how that's really lived out in the community. But I think that one of our failings as a church is that we don't seem to have been able to connect this message to the ordinary membership. I don't know, we preach and we teach, but somehow when you read the New Testament and you see the witness that's in the early 2nd century, how people were willing to die and were found happily willing to give their life for the cause of Christ, and we don't seem to be able to produce that kind of commitment.
Yes, sir. I think a part of the challenge from my observation, even if we go back historically, we know that let's say, if we take it from the movement of the Jerusalem church, the moment empires got involved in the doing of church, there began that watering down of the true spirit and witness of what the Christian church was all about. So in many ways, the church has become so political that it does not see its pastoral and prophetic ministry, and it doesn't take it seriously. Everything, we want to align ourselves in terms of administratively along certain procedures or policies based on what is established in the world. But the governance within the early Christian church had an order, but that order was rooted in the resurrection event, and that those whom the resurrected Christ entrusted that message to, and those who were trained and prepared by those trusted servants. Now we are trusting ourselves to give direction and oversight of the Christian church, rather than trusting the Spirit of the Christ who is raised, and he promised that in my absence I will send another me, the Paraclete, and he will do certain things, remind you of what I've said. He will convict the world of sin, of unrighteousness, and of the judgment that is to come. So I think that we give the impression as if the Christian church was in a disadvantaged state in its genesis, rather than seeing the richness of how the church was able to order itself, submit itself to spiritual authority, and how the church was able to adapt to the various changes when the Gentiles were being brought into the Christian faith. So we need to, I think a part of the challenge, Archbishop, is that a lot of us who are practicing Christian ministry in a 21st century world, we are not students of church history. We don't understand the genesis of the Christian church. What we are doing is we are reacting to something that someone did. We start our own congregation. It has its own philosophy, and it's all man-made. All the traditions related to how I feel, what I think, but there is no going back to the historical roots. And what we keep doing, as opposed to looking at those doctrines, those practices, those forms that are germane to the entire Christian world, we are pushing ecclesiology, church stance, and church polity as Christian doctrine.
And unfortunately, that's almost reigning supreme now across the spectrum.
Yes.
And I'm glad you went back to the whole question of the beginnings, because I think somebody the first Sunday after the Ascension, I preached on the theme of that the church did not start on the day of Pentecost, because Jesus left the church, and he left the church in waiting. You are to wait.
Absolutely.
You're not to move until the Father gives you
the fulfillment of the promise.
You wait here. But the first thing they did, led by Peter, was to organize. You have to choose a successor. You are praying and working together. The waiting church is also a church that is organizing to become more effective as soon as he gives the word and he releases us.
Definitely.
Now, I think that a lot of us don't pay attention to the first description of that witness is, they say, we are witnesses to the resurrection. And it is the resurrected Christ that is at the heart of everything that we are meant to proclaim. And it seems to me that a lot of our preaching, we've lost sight of that. And we have become so trying to create impressions and to, in some instances, to give the impression that we are
inventing something new. It's about us. I think that's a part of the problem. We keep inserting ourselves in the message rather than allowing Christ to speak. He is larger than life. He transcends language, all the barriers, the distinctions that we make. He is bigger than all those things. And when we zone in on ourselves or our own opinions, we diminish the largeness of this Christ, who is able to bring about solutions for a world that is rocking and reeling because of its own bad choices.
And the transformation that he brings.
Yes, sir.
And it's part, last Sunday, our gospel reading was on the storm.
Stilling of the sea, yes.
And where he really rebukes them, because he said, if you really had faith, all of this confusion, you would not have been put out by it.
Well, someone says lack of faith in Jesus is worse than any storm.
And but he emphasizes the question of unbelief. And it does seem to me that that's one of our biggest challenges in today's world is, how do we counteract unbelief? Because there's a lot of unbelief underneath the surface of church life. A lot of people who go to church regularly are not really that strong in faith. And then in the secular world, it's dismissed completely. I mean, there's no room for that.
And I think that the didactic, the teaching arm of the Christian church has to be re-engaged. I know that a lot of persons, particularly in neo-Pentecostal or neo-charismatic movements, they claim to be more teachers of the word, but the content of their teaching is sorely lacking. I think that when the church is called to exercise that teaching ministry, that teaching is, as you said earlier, against the backdrop of the resurrection. Everything that the church does, says, or is rooted in the resurrection. If Christ be not risen from the dead, then our preaching, our witness, everything we do is vain, and we are fraudulent.
We are of all people most miserable.
Yes, sir.
If we will take our first break at this point.